I was inspired by the arrival or return of General MacArthur, and I said, I'm gonna be a freedom fighter.
I left the island in 1964 to go to the University of Washington. My father sold a portion of his land so that I could go to college.
I was born in the Philippines, in a town of Bacara, Ilocos Norte. That's the province.
That's my heritage. That's where, you know, my background is. But also, I say American because I was born here and raised the American way.
I'm Filomena Almuhela Almirol. I was born in the Philippines on August 7, 1921.
At the start of World War II, the Philippines were an American protectorate. Seeing the strategic importance of the islands, the Japanese bombed Manila the same day they attacked Pearl Harbor. At that time, Manila was a bustling city, as were a handful of other port cities. However, life elsewhere on the islands was primitive, as shown in these photos taken by an American doctor stationed on Leyte. Constant battles between occupying Japanese and Filipino guerrillas degraded living conditions for Filipino families. The two subjects of this film, Filomena Almirol and Edwin Soriano, lived through this turbulent history in their native Philippines.
My first subject was English. And as we were seated preparing, the professor has not entered the room, and there was an announcement from the office that there is a bomb dropped in Hawaii, and everybody was alarmed. Some are crying loud, I have to go home, because most of us come from everywhere from the Philippines. The bombing of Hawaii, we were ordered to have blackouts, no lights at all. So everybody has to, who have children, have to feed the children before the sunset.
Ed Soriano was one of hundreds of thousands of Filipino youngsters whose childhoods were scarred by the Japanese occupation. Soriano left the Philippines at the age of 19 as a member of the U.S. Navy, but to this day he retains close ties to the land of his birth and has strong concerns about its future.
My wife's a retired nurse, and we go to we do medical missions. We distribute vitamins, medicine, and it's mostly, we donated the medicines. My aunt who lives in Hawaii, she's a PhD pharmacy, and she's got contacts with different pharmaceuticals, and sometimes she raises enough money to buy medicines for these medical missions that we have. And we are so active with our local high school group also, and provide them what we can, like books, band instruments, or whatever. And I had a chance to ask questions from the students, and what is your ambition? You said, and surprisingly, I didn't expect that kind of answer. Is it the answer they gave me is to go abroad is their answer. In other words, they probably have lost hope already, and what I really was expecting is, they would like to be an engineer, or, things like that. But to have an answer like that, to go abroad, is just like cutting your head off when you get a headache.
One wonders how much of the lack of hope among today's generation of Filipinos is a result of the brutalities of World War II. As a young woman in Manila, Mrs. Almirol was keenly aware of the increasing hardships and dangers of life during the Japanese occupation.
Schools were closed, so we all stayed home. Those who are working didn't go to work. But my brothers were employed as firemen. I didn't see my brother for so many days because they were preparing also when the Japanese army will attack Manila. Then the Japanese came. So markets were closed, schools were closed, stores were closed. After, I don't know how long was that, there was looting in the city of Manila. All the stores were looted. So nothing to go to buy your needs. Everything was in black market. If you want rice for the family, you have to join the line early in the morning before you can have 2 pounds of rice.
Once the Japanese occupiers arrived, the Filipinos realized that the Japanese who had lived among them for years were not what they had seemed, but were actually advanced scouts and military reservists active in Japan's quest for empire.
Those Japanese who were were in the Philippines those days before the war, most of them are businessmen. And one of my brothers worked in the store owned by a Japanese. And he was the one who prepared him. When they closed the store, he was working. He was the one who put all his money in his pocket everywhere so he could bring home the money. I don't know if he arrived home or not. He was a captain of the Japanese army. See, he was an officer. Those Japanese who are working there are mostly connected with the army. They are not really businessmen. They are there for to know the island, the city very well.
As World War II dragged on, daily life, especially travel, became extraordinarily difficult for the Filipino people. They were beset on one side by the occupying Japanese and on the other by native guerrillas who opposed both Japan and its puppet government in Manila. Remnants of U.S. forces who had escaped capture after the U.S. surrender at Bataan in April 1942 aided native resistance to the occupation. Soriano remembers the involvement of the older members of his family with the guerrillas.
Then the U.S. came in the Philippines, and most of the time, they were forming guerrillas, which is always the formula for any liberating country to get the cooperation of the local people, establish a guerrilla, and then later on the guerrillas were funded by the U.S. Army anyway, and blowing up a lot of Japanese soldiers, and they got mad at us and started getting cruel to the Filipino people at that time, which my uncle was tortured in front of the whole town and died. I have a lot of relatives that died. My father was was a guerrilla, and I remember what he used to tell me, that when he was being chased, shot at, riding his bicycle and the chain keeps coming off and he picks up the bicycle and ran.
The civilian population was constantly harassed by the Japanese troops. Young girls faced unique dangers, as did anyone suspected of guerrilla activity. Mrs. Almirol found ingenious ways to disguise her vulnerability.
The Japanese were also not only fighting the government. There were rebels, Filipino rebels, who were against the government. They were called Hokbalahats. So they are also against too. They are against the country, and at the same time, the rebels might also have a fight with them. So on the way, you are both, you fear the Japanese, who hardly understand English or Tagalog, and if they investigate you, you don't know how to answer. Whatever question, we don't understand them. If they don't understand, there's a slap on your face or kick or like that. There were no doctors anymore. They closed their offices. We cannot, they have to hide. Everybody has to hide. If they say men, young men, they always ask, are you a guerrilla? They will say, because that's their enemy. And they said, no. So I got brothers and nephews. If you wash their pants and they see hanging pants on the clothesline, they will investigate you. The Japanese, if they say those pants, whose pants are those? They always suspect you that you are hiding guerrillas or soldiers. I was a guerrilla too. But I don't tell the truth. I don't tell the people because we were not in the register. When I came from the city, the guerrillas ordered the captain of the barrio to enlist all women ages from 16 to 35. Those who as women's auxiliary service. We served the guerrillas because a guerrilla stayed in our town. It was full of guerrillas, but they were in the mountains. And one of the barrios is full of that. The Japanese didn't know that. So those who were hurt fighting against the Japanese, they have to bring home the hurt one, and we take good care of them. I was now one of them. I was a cook. I cook for them. If you are single, they always ask if you are single. If you are single and they like you, they can kidnap you or what. We always act like old women like that. We don't. My mother said, wear my skirt and use my kimono. So I appear like an old woman with my, don't powder your face, he said. Because if a Japanese happens and you appear beautiful to them, they might rape you or what. That's the most scary part of women in our places before. It affects me emotionally. And if somebody asks you if you are single, no, I got my nephews around, I got children. Then one time I was so sickly, I got migraines. My mother sent me to a medicine man, to another barrio, 20 miles away from home. Then one day the captain of the barrio brought home 10 Japanese soldiers. And they want to check if there are guerrillas hiding in their barrio. And they found none. Then that house where I stayed is a relative. And I was cooking, I was helping cook dinner. And the sergeant asked the owner of the house, "Who is that cooking in your kitchen?" "That's our relative." "Is she a single woman?" "Barasang." Barasang means single woman. And he said, "No, she got a son, that one sitting by the table, but it was my nephew." I got so scared when they told me about that. Because he said, I like her.
That morning, when my brother and I woke up, there were nobody in the house. My parents and my mom and my brothers and sisters were gone. And we heard later that they were gathered at the town plaza to witness some of the torture that the town officials who were gathered in there. A lot of people got tortured at that time.
In May 1944, in the city of Manila, my two brothers were still firemen. The captain of one of the stations, the captain of the firemen was caught by the Japanese, and they took him as prisoner. They heard that maybe there was a spy who told him that most of the firefighters are guerrillas. They are their enemies. So they took that captain and investigated him. And they said, "If you tell the truth, give us the names of your men," because he was supposed to be the captain of the fire department. So the Japanese thought that he was also the captain of the guerrillas. So they tortured him, and then they promised him that he will be given freedom if he will tell all the names of his men. All he told was all his best friends in the fire department. He told 56 in all. But they didn't free him. They killed him after naming some of them. He passed out and died because they tortured him too much. So the Japanese began to got the list, and then went from house to house getting all those names, and my brothers were there. They took my eldest brother at 6 o'clock in the morning. They told my sister, "Oh, your husband will come back. We'll just investigate him." Never came back. Then at 12 o'clock, they went to get my younger brother, who was also in the fire department. At 12 o'clock at night, they took all those firemen named by their captain, except the electrician. So out of 56 named, only the electrician was free because he went to sleep in another family, to a relative. He didn't sleep in his own house. So life began harder because nobody came home, they said. They brought them to a certain place in the nearest province of Manila. There's Pasig. There is a small hill by that city of Pasay, where they tortured them, and they said after collecting so many, they are all massacred. We began praying for them. We said novena for my two brothers. I began crying. My tears never stopped for 2 weeks. I thought I'll become sick. Even though I'm not crying, the tears are falling down continuously like that.
General MacArthur left the Philippines in March 1942, he vowed to return. Although war in the Pacific was initially a holding action while U.S. forces battled in the European theater, America was eventually able to turn the might of its naval forces to the war in the Pacific. After bloody battles on Guadalcanal, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, American forces reached the Philippines, with MacArthur waiting ashore at Leyte on October 22, 1944. Mrs. Almirol remembers the last frantic days of the Japanese in Manila.
Relative came home from Manila. The city was already clearing up after that. The Americans already arrived in Leyte, so there was bombing in the capital of our province. We heard the bombing of the port. Then the Japanese soldiers were left there. They told us this story. And there are last days also. Even those kind Japanese, they became also tigers. Oh, how they told the story, how they tortured the civilians. And some of the Japanese said, if they see a child, they said, I remember my children when I see children playing like this. But then when the Americans came to save us, they heard that they will be prisoners. They tortured all the civilians they saw. And one of the most inhuman I heard is they'll toss the baby and take their bayonet to catch the baby. Oh, how I cried. I cannot endure those. I'm lucky I'm still alive.
Meanwhile, Ed Soriano, being a young boy, watched the victorious entry of the U.S. forces with boyish enthusiasm.
I remember that there was a victory parade. I mean, the whole motorcade was there. They were throwing Hershey bars, candies, of course, cigarettes was one of the things. And everybody made a signal of a V. I still remember the smell of beer. You got Pabst Blue Ribbon cans in there, and said, that thing smells so good. And chiclets is a chewing gum, and Wrigley's. Oh, I remember those. But I can't forget those Hershey bars, Milky Way, and all of that. Oh, and it's all the Americans. I mean, it was so favored that as little kids we play war games with the other kids, and we say, oh, I'm the American and you the Japanese. I mean, it was always like that. Before I was born, the Philippines was still a territory in the United States, and we were brought up to be, you know, American loving people.
When Mrs. Almirol received word that Manila was under American control, she made her trip back to search for loved ones.
Then after saying the novena, after a month, I recovered. Then my brother and I went to the city to get my sister-in-laws and their children, because food was also scarce, and who will feed them? So we went that's my first time to walk 17 miles continuously without stopping. If you are really strong-willed, You can do it.
As the war ended, life began a slow return to normalcy among the ruins. Soldiers came home and married. Mrs. Almirol resumed her teaching career.
After the war, there were many Filipinos who came home and married Filipino women. So whenever they call them balikbayan, homecoming. The homecoming Filipinos, they always introduce to women. They always try to introduce their brother or uncle to me, and I find an alibi not to meet them. There was a border in our house in Manila from Bataan province, where the Japanese stayed there. He said, why don't you apply in our province? We need teachers. He said. The school buildings were all bombed. They have to teach. My first cooking class in grade 5 was done under a tree. And it was 52 kids in one class. My God, I said, if the room maybe is smaller than this, and you have 52 kids who stopped for 2 or 3 years, so they are overage.
Innate strength and faith enabled individuals like Filomena Almirol and Ed Soriano to resume their lives after the war. For many, their way up led them to leave the Philippines for the United States of America.
The great aspirations to come to the United States has been always the number one thing. And from high school, I put in my application because they were recruiting Filipinos in the Navy. I went in at Sangley Point, Cavite. That's the naval station towards Manila. And that's where the recruiting station was. And amongst an application that reported that day of 500 people, only 15 of us were selected. My father was so proud of me. And it was quite an experience coming here.
Although Soriano left the Philippines through service in the U.S. Navy, his hope is that today's Filipino youth will remain in the Philippines as its hope for the future.
I wish they doing something in the Philippines that are going to make the future a lot better than what we have observed after an absence of over 40 years.
If you are really strong-willed, you can do it.